Hello, and welcome to the Climbing Majority podcast. I just want to say a quick thank you to all of our listeners. Your viewership is keeping Kyle and I stoked to continue having these conversations and finding great, engaging guests to have on the show. In today's episode, we speak with Eric Carter. Eric is an Arc'teryx athlete who resides in Squamish, British Columbia. He spent 5 years on the U.S. national ski mountaineering team. He holds the speed record on Mount Rainier and the Tantalus Traverse. Eric has a master's in exercise physiology and a PhD where he studied the effects of altitude on humans. Today's episode will cover topics such as Eric's journey from racing cross-country skiing to skiing the big mountains. We discuss snow safety and the importance of avalanche training. How to manage time as an athlete and a student. We discuss Eric's training volume, having fun, proper rest, uphill training, and the importance of strength training and your aerobic base. And finally, we do a deep dive into Eric's recent trip to ski a first descent on a peak in the Himalaya. Where you grew up, that kind of stuff, and we'll kind of go from there.
Sure. Yeah, I live in Squamish, British Columbia, and I've been here for probably about 13 years. I moved to BC to go to UBC for grad school. I specialize in human kinetics or kinesiology, I guess, and kind of environmental physiology specifically. So like altitude and that kind of related stuff. So that's what brought me here. Before that, I was born in, or I grew up in Minnesota, I should say, and was primarily like a cross-country skier. And so that was kind of my sporting base. And so that means in the summer, lots of running, and then did quite a bit of climbing there as well. Minnesota is not really like a climbing destination, but there are some cool spots. There's a place called Taylor's Falls. That was the closest outdoor climbing to where I lived. And then there's a decent amount of ice climbing up in northern Minnesota. And then you're not too far from like Devil's Tower. And so I was pretty lucky that I got kind of exposed to that. There's a early gym there called Vertical Endeavors. And got to go kind of play around there and then do a bit of actual outdoor climbing before moving to Vermont for college, where I cross-country skied as well. So I kind of took a bit of a break from climbing, even though there's also good climbing in Vermont, but was more focused on the skiing, and then eventually did come to BC, knowing that there was a lot of cool mountain sports and all that kind of stuff here. That was the big draw. It was around the time of the Olympics and stuff. And so it seemed like a cool way to get out of the States and go someplace that kind of piqued my interest. And the school is really good as well, and much cheaper than any American university, which is nice. So yeah, it was kind of like all signs pointed north, or mostly west, I guess. And came out here, and then obviously being, close proximity to Squamish, for school, just climbing tons, skiing tons. When I first came here, I was still actually mostly cross-country skiing, but actually or the coast is not very good for cross-country skiing. We've got a few places on the North Shore and up by Whistler, but because of like the amount of snow we get, there's just so much snow, and often how wet it is at lower elevations, the cross-country skiing is quite bad unless it's really good, and then it's awesome. But pretty quickly, you're cruising around like in the rain or whatever on the piste and looking at the mountains above, getting snow, and it's like, oh, maybe it's worth getting up there and getting off the kind of hamster wheel. So pretty quickly pivoted from mostly cross-country skiing and kind of rock and alpine climbing, and then into more ski mountaineering, which is kind of what's led to where I am now.
Nice. I'm gonna roll it back real quick. So back
Yeah.
when you were like, how early did you start your cross country skiing? Was it in high school, elementary school?
Yeah, it was like as long as I can remember. I think,
Wow. Okay.
my dad had me out skiing when I was really little. So I'm
And
not going to like claim that I learned to ski before I walked, but it
pretty
was
much.
very, very small. Yeah.
And climbing, you're someone who got introduced to climbing from a gym.
Um, I think where I lived in Minnesota, there was this kind of, before there was an REI nearby, there was a shop called Galleons, um, which was kind of like a sports check or something, like not quite as fancy as REI of an outdoor shop. Anyway, they had like one of those kind of small walls at the back of the store that I think was more for trying shoes on than anything. And I remember trying it there and being, or just trying climbing on the wall. I think my dad actually took me there a few times just to like play on this wall. I think the staff were just kind of like, yeah, whatever. Um, but I think they had an advert for a guide, and we went with him to Taylor's Falls. So um, it was pretty quick that I got to try outdoor climbing, and then from there it was kind of a mix of doing little trips there, um, and learning how to kind of set up an anchor and all that stuff, and then also climbing in the gym. So it was a bit of a mix actually, but yeah, probably a bit more gym time.
Cool. I mean, it sounds pretty cool. You definitely got into the outside pretty early on, and it looks like you had the guiding experience right at the beginning, which is, at least in our experience that we've interviewed and for ourselves, is pretty unheard of, which is pretty sweet. And yeah, did you have like a mentor in your kind of climbing and I guess athletic field most of your life, or were you kind of charging ahead on your own, kind of like leading that path and finding out what you needed to do on your own?
Yeah, no doubt. Like tons of people that I would kind of consider mentors, I would say, throughout the different aspects of my career. I think in more organized sports like cross country skiing, I was on teams with formal coaches and stuff like that, and a few of those guys I would definitely kind of consider personal mentors as well. Um, and then yeah, I got to, well, when I was climbing with my dad, neither of us had any clue about what was going on, and so I was trying to, learn from other people, and yeah, occasionally going out with guides and things like that. But then coming here and doing more alpine climbing and ski mountaineering for sure. I wouldn't say I've had any like formal mentor, but I've been really lucky to be surrounded by partners and kind of people that have wanted to spend time together and to kind of impart that experience. So kind of on a less formal side, but I would still consider that kind of the best form of mentorship, really.
For
And
sure.
so I've been
Yeah, I
really
think
lucky that way.
yeah, it seems like you're surrounded by people who are able to impart knowledge onto you rather than constantly being surrounded by people who you're the one imparting knowledge onto them, even though you might not be that experienced. There's like that, that stacking of level of absorbing knowledge constantly and progressing, which is pretty cool that you've had that most of your life.
Yeah, I think a big advantage for me is coming into it with a big aerobic, uh, you know, capacity or experience. So if I want to go do something, um, it it's actually like not the physical challenge that's going to hold me back, or at least when I was kind of learning. Um, so I'm not going to be the guy that's like dogging it on the approach. And I think that goes a long ways, for partners that are looking for people. Yeah, maybe they're willing to tolerate if you can just follow the whole route or whatever, but not so much if you can't even make it to the base, kind of thing. So for me, that was a big advantage, and I think that goes a long way.
Yeah, I've heard that like cross country skiing is pretty synonymous with what you're talking about. Like I've heard it quoted that it's like the highest VO2 max of any sport, and I think a lot of really elite level athletes, come out with a cross country ski background. So yeah, I mean, no surprise there, at least from my end on that. I'm wondering, like, do you view yourself like as a climber and a skier, or do you view like climbing as something that you do to like facilitate better skiing and bigger skiing objectives?
A little bit of both, I would say. Definitely skiing is my preferred method. The Like, it just sucks walking downhill, compared to skiing. It always sucks. There's no way that it's fun. Whether you're running, whether you're hiking, skiing is just 100% better. So I would rather be doing that. As far as like kind of the ideal day for me is really like choosing the best tools and like the best style or technique, whatever you want to call it, to kind of accomplish that goal that I want to set out for that day. So like, I like to go to really cool places. I like, spectacular views. I like being in technical terrain. And I want to do that in kind of the most efficient and like logical style that I can. There's no sense in lugging up a bunch of extra gear if it's not necessary, but also like if I can ski down faster, then that's great too.
Are you at this point in your life? I guess I'm not a skier, and so forgive me for my lingo here. I'm definitely mostly a climber.
It's okay.
But are there skiing FAs, like first ascents, first descents?
Yeah.
Are there like, okay? And now are you at that point in your life or in your career where you're chasing what are they called? Or what are they
first
called?
Descents,
First descents. Are you chasing that, or and if you are, at what point did you shift from repeating routes to transferring into this more explorative medium?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's definitely one of the things that kind of drives my skiing or my goals in the mountains is like looking for stuff that's new or that hasn't been done before. But it's not really, I would say, the only thing. Skiing is a funny one because I guess with climbing, there's kind of an unending progression, right? Like technically climbs can just get harder and harder, like steeper and steeper and smaller holds. And so the limitation is the human ability to actually stick to that wall. But with skiing, like snow only sticks to a certain degree of slope. And so once you find that like maximum steepness slope, it doesn't get a whole lot harder, which, a lot of people could probably take issue with that, but practically that is true. Then to make it more complicated, you add in things like objective hazard, like if there's sracks or cornices or things like that on the line. And then, maybe there's technical sections where you have to climb up or down, or you have to climb something to access it. So realistically, skiing does get harder. And so in kind of like training or progressing in the sport, there are lots of ski lines, that you can look at as kind of progressively more and more complicated and bigger ticks. But in reality, like when you're actually making turns in good snow, that is very much not a progression. So it's all these other skills that you have to develop to push that along. And so I've kind of deviated from your question, but for me, I guess, looking for those things that haven't been done, or that maybe some people have looked at and kind of not even thought about as an option. And I think that's a really like common thing, even in pretty busy places. I hear a lot of people talking about like, oh, this place or that place, even around here is skied out and all the plumb lines have been picked. And I think that's kind of a silly thing because often, you have a really nice couloir that's been skied and gets skied a lot and it's super classic. And then like right next to it, there's something that's smaller and more technical, and that, maybe costs a little bit more. But because people just zone in on that one classic, it kind of gets overlooked. And I think that's pretty well shown, in the Mont Blanc range around Chamonix, where people are still skiing first descents. The top guys and women are still taken down these lines that like should have been skied 20 years ago or something, because there's just so many people doing it. It's like such a hub for ski alpinism. It's kind of like, wow, if they can pluck these lines, then certainly we can on the coast where there's friggin' nobody, that there's like no roads. It's hard to get places, and there's very few actual, people going for it. So there's so much here to go after. It's pretty cool.
How early on did your mindset shift from repeating routes to this? That was cool. I loved your answer.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go on another tangent there. I think the other cool thing about skiing, and this is similar to alpine climbing or ice climbing, is that the routes change so much between seasons or between days even. You can get a route in boilerplate conditions that's freaking terrifying, or you can have it in POW and you're just like making glory turns. Like, it's awesome. And so the big lines, the really scary lines around here or anywhere, especially like when there's not multiple parties going on them, in a season or in a month, it does kind of feel like you're a little bit out. What's the right word? Not on your own, but doing something new. You're kind of exploring it for the first time, and so even repeating routes, I think in skiing is something that we need to treat fairly seriously as they get into the more serious routes. Sure, when you have like a trade route that's getting skied every week or whatever, it's a little bit less like that. But yeah, so to actually answer your question, it wasn't really until kind of COVID, I guess I would say. So when I did come to BC, I started competing in ski mountaineering racing, which is it's obviously the competitive form of ski mountaineering, and it's a little bit silly. It's kind of a cross between cross-country skiing and downhill racing, but it is super fun. You're kind of just like running around in the mountains like a bit of a psycho and just rallying around stuff. And so the scene is quite serious in Europe, where it kind of came from military skiing. So in the Alps, they would go on these military patrols through the mountains. And that turned into racing, like to prepare for it. And then that kind of translated into civilian racing. And then that became an actual competitive sport with, professionals and all that stuff. So I competed on the national team from 2014 to 2019 and did 3 seasons living in Chamonix, racing on the World Cup and all that stuff. And so it would have been, the 2019 season I competed, and then the 2020, 2021 season was supposed to be a world championship season. They do it every 2 years instead of every year. And so that was kind of my goal, was to compete in that event and then probably finish racing. I'm a little bit older than I was then even, than a lot of the other competitors. And so it was kind of looking like a good time to stop racing and focus on other stuff. But obviously with COVID, all the racing got canceled. I didn't go spend another season there, all that. It was really good. I was able to finish my degree, but not good for competing. So at that point, I definitely pivoted from being more competition focused to more adventure focused. And even while I was competing, I was still getting out on some pretty rad adventures. Like I can't complain. I will admit that there was definitely some conflicting moments when I was in Cham, training between races, and you're like skinning up the piste in Les Houches, and then you're looking at Mont Blanc and all the peaks up there. It's like, I would definitely be rather climbing and skiing up there than skinning up this piste. But I still had a chance to do quite a lot of rad stuff, both in Europe and here. But yeah, certainly once kind of the competition chapter closed, moved more into adventure stuff. And I think by that time I had accumulated a lot of that, a lot of the classics and kind of the repeat stuff. And then it was like, okay, I'm stuck here. We can't travel like anywhere. We couldn't go to the Rockies. We couldn't do anything. So what's the stuff locally that I want to tick off? What are the lines that I've been eyeing all these years while I'm training? What is the new stuff that I'm thinking about, or, that I saw flying around or anything like that? And that's when it really like was like, okay, let's tick some stuff off. So I think last season, which would have been the 2021 season, was super productive, because it was just like, all right, we're here, we're watching conditions, don't have anywhere else to go. I got a list, and yeah.
Nice. That's super cool.
Yeah, super cool, man. So I guess, like we've kind of gone through this progression. You're talking about like competing and stuff, and now we're getting a little more into the adventure side of things you do. And I know like recently you came back from a trip from the Himalayas, and I think when we were like corresponding, I mentioned like your ski descent of the Chief, and you're like, oh, well, there's things that I've done that like I was way more proud of that than that. Like I think that was like a really clicky thing, but like for me, I thought that was quite fascinating. And I was wondering if maybe you'd be open to just like talking about a few of these experiences, and potentially just like starting with the Himalaya, because I'm quite interested, like what goes into that process of like inception to packing for the expedition to kind of going out there, and where did you go and what were your objectives?
Yeah, well, that's a pretty long story, but I'll do my best. So yeah, with sticking around here the last two kind of springs, I was definitely jonesing to go somewhere. And I've been kind of trying to like mind my travel and be a little bit more responsible with it. Previous years, with competition, like making 2 or 3 European flights and a handful of American flights, it felt a little silly. So it was actually kind of nice to reset and not go anywhere, and then think about like, okay, how can I do this? It's my job to go cool places and travel and all that stuff, but also I want to do that responsibly. And so that was part of it. And it was kind of thinking like, okay, if I'm gonna go somewhere, let's make it rad and make it worthwhile. And certainly the Himalaya has been on my radar for as long as I've been a climber. I remember, again, like my dad taking me to a slideshow by Ed Viesters, who's a fairly famous American mountaineer in Minnesota in when I was 10 or something, and being fairly impressed by his exploits in the Himalaya. And so stuff like that like sticks with you. And obviously like classic mountaineering literature has a big Himalayan component. Anyway, so last kind of spring and summer, I started to think like, okay, this is a good opportunity for me. I don't have a family. It's like a good time to go there and see what's going on and try hard. So, did decent amount of research, reading the Alpine journals and looking at the Himalayan database, and just kind of like cruising around people's social media profiles and stuff like that to get a sense of where people go and what people do. It's not a super well reported on scene, Himalayan skiing. Like you can look at the list of ski descents on 8,000 meter peaks, and that's pretty well reported. But other than that, it's kind of under the radar. And I'm not super interested in skiing an 8,000er. Like, I don't want to die at altitude. I don't want to like even particularly suffer at altitude. So that stuff is kind of like, I don't know that I would turn down a trip, but it's not my first choice. So then started to kind of look at different places that would be interesting to go. And there are a few guys locally here that have done some Himalayan trips. One guy, Trevor Hunt, is a major kind of first ascensionist and adventure skier here in the coast. And so had some good talks with him and a few other guys about places to look. And then honestly, like it really was, I use an app called FatMap, which is kind of like Google Earth. You can visualize like 3D satellite imagery. And it was just like flying around in FatMap and looking at mountains and being like, that looks cool. So started looking for, based off these areas that I kind of knew might have potential, just cruising around and looking for big faces and big couloirs, and eventually found one that really jumped out. Trevor had suggested looking at the area near Meru, which is the one that the Jimmy Chin and Conrad Anker made a climbing movie about Meru. And so that zone is right at the headwaters of the Ganges River. There's Meru, there's Shivling, there's the Bhagirathi peaks, and it's like a super well-known zone for climbing. Like lots has been done there. And then the town at the roadhead is a place called Gangotri. And that town is fairly famous within India as the starting point, there's a temple in Gangotri that a lot of Hindu pilgrims go to as part of a religious festival to more or less collect holy water, I think, from the Ganges. I'm probably butchering this a little bit, but it is a popular area. And then from that town, some of those pilgrims will hike a day or two up to literally the headwaters of the Ganges, where it comes out of the Gangotri Glacier. And that is a fairly sacred spot to kind of scoop water from, basically. But there's these big ice caves and stuff. So all to say, it was an area that had infrastructure in place, and also had some pretty wild peaks. And so tried to do some research, couldn't find any or much history of very much skiing in that area. Shivling has been skied, but we were looking at a peak called Bhrigupanth, and that was kind of off on a side valley. It's like a 6,900 meter peak. And it's got this beautiful face on it, really spectacular looking. And so after that, kind of started firing around, ideas to some potential partners and starting pitching it to sponsors. And so that kind of like is a logistically challenging portion, is convincing sponsors that they should pay for it, convincing partners that they should trust you and go for it, and then also kind of starting to plan the actual in-country logistics. And so trying to get all that, in the right order is a little tricky, but ultimately worked out really well. Because we were funded, we were able to go reasonably, like we weren't fully on the lowest budget plan. And so we actually reached out to the guys that Jimmy and Conrad used for Meru as their logistics company. So you kind of have to have someone helping you in country. And for us, like especially going as skiers, for a longer period of time, you have to have a base camp basically. And that means you have to have porters and cooks and all this kind of stuff. So very quickly, logistically, it becomes more challenging. Anyways, we use this company called Ibex Expeditions, and the owner there is Mandeep Singh Soin, and they were super helpful. They're very familiar with that area, obviously, because they've been on a bunch of these expeditions, and all their guys were really experienced. And so then once we got them involved, it was a lot easier to start the preparations kind of in country. You have to apply for peak permits, which in India is fairly expensive. It's much cheaper than climbing an 8,000 meter peak, but compared to like Pakistan, it's a lot.
Could you ballpark a price of expensive? Just out of curiosity, like what is it for like a permit for a peak?
For us, I think it was ultimately we paid kind of stuff all together, but I think the peak fee was around $3,000 US. So not terrible, right? But it's still like it's a chunk of money.
Yeah, it's substantial,
but
for
it's
what
not
you're
the
doing.
$10,000 that you pay for Everest.
The lucrative industry of climbing
I'm
as
curious,
well.
Yeah,
the lucrative industry of owning a mountain.
yeah.
I'm curious as to more about these logistics, especially in, I don't know if you don't know, it's totally fine, but like more wild places like Pakistan and Kazakhstan, like who's the governing body for those peaks, and like how does that whole system work? I'm interested the fact that you are paying people to get onto a mountain. Like that concept to me is foreign. So do you have
I
any
think that's
more
pretty
kind of information on that process?
Anywhere you're going for the world, especially higher altitude peaks, is like you have to pull permits. Same thing for any 8,000 meter peak. You got to pull permits. You got to get everything worked out, the logistics. So yeah, but you can answer more, Eric.
Totally. I mean, it's not unlike climbing on Rainier or Denali, where you buy a climbing permit. I think, well, actually, this is probably arguable, but I suspect the climbing fees here go a little bit more directly to benefit the mountain itself, but I'm not so sure about that either. But I can speak to India, less so to Pakistan or other countries. Yeah, in India, the peak fee goes to the Indian Mountaineering Federation. So it's kind of like a quasi-governmental organization. I think they're somewhat related, but it's like kind of the equivalent of the Alpine Club of Canada or the American Alpine Club. So they regulate all the expeditions. And the cool thing about India is that they don't actually grant multiple permits for the same zone. So like if you want to go to Shivling and you get your peak permit you get your permit from the IMF, you're going to be the only team on Shivling at that time. It's not like, say, Nepal, where there's hundreds of teams climbing, certain routes on certain peaks. So it's pretty cool. India feels pretty wild. And the other cool thing for us is, I think, and I could be wrong about this, but this was the impression that we got going there, was that we were the first team from out of the country to come since COVID. So we were the first, non-Indians to be climbing there, which people seemed pretty psyched about, to have, foreigners coming for the first time in a while. But yeah, I think generally like India has a bit more red tape than some of these other countries. Probably, I would guess because there's just this like super residual hangover of British colonialism, and that really messed up a lot of kind of what's going on there. I mean, maybe there's some good things to it, but for the most part, like it seems like they carried on a lot of bureaucracy and kind of red tape that is just the result of the British rule there. And so I think there are a lot of government organizations and jobs and things like that that are just in place to kind of create work and to be jobs. And so I think that's probably the case here. But yeah, I mean, so the area we were is part of a national park, and it was protected, and there were rangers and stuff like that around. Not quite, like you'd see in U.S. national parks, but it seemed like they were trying to protect these places and take care of it. So I'm hopeful that our funds went there, not to some bureaucrats, pockets or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Now, when you were choosing a partner, was this objective technically possible without a partner?
I mean, hypothetically, I guess kind of anything is, but for me,
I guess like what were you looking for in your partner, and what are the biggest things that you see beneficial to having a partner for this particular objective?
Yeah, skiing, like you kind of want to have partners for the most part, just out of avalanche concerns and all that stuff, which ultimately didn't turn out to be too much of an issue, but that's further in the story. And so yeah, and then for me, I really like doing stuff with partners in the mountains. I certainly love solo missions when they're appropriate, but I think like mountain climbing and skiing, it's a partner sport. You work better as a team, and you can handle stuff, and you can and do stuff in that sense. And I'm really lucky that I have an amazing, group of partners around me that I can operate on a pretty high level with. And so that is it's like a performance enhancing thing. It's not a detrimental thing to have partners around. So for this, basically you need a partner that is willing to go to the Himalayas on kind of a whim and is capable of kind of the technical components, which aren't super crazy, but are real. And you're going to get along for like a month in India and not kill each other.
That's probably
which is probably the most important one. Yeah. And then, there's kind of the smaller things, like you have to kind of be on the same page about certain things. But yeah, so for me, it was like pretty easy decision. Like I have a partner that I ski with the vast majority of the time, a friend named Paul Greenwood. And he was actually the first person I met in Canada, which is funny. We both rented a room at the same place and realized that we were both into the same stuff, climbing and skiing. But we do most of our skiing together. And so, he was obviously the first person that I sent the text to with the screenshot, being like, "Hey, let's go here." And he's always pretty reliably in. And then the other guy that came with us was another athlete on the Arc'teryx team named Tom Pfeiffer, and he's a Freeride World Tour competitor and just like an amazing skier. He can ski anything, almost to his detriment. But we had done a bit of touring last year, and I kind of, I remember watching him ski, and then also I remember seeing him. We were climbing on Mount Garibaldi here in town, and I think it was his first time. Maybe it wasn't his first time putting crampons on or something, something crazy like that. And we had to climb this relatively easy mixed pitch, and I led up it, and he was just like, "Yeah, no problem. Like I'm on a top rope, I can do this." And I was like, "Oh, cool, sweet." And sure enough, he cruised right up it, like no issues. We got to the top and then we skied off and ripped down this thing. So I was like, okay, this guy is super solid. Like he can do stuff in the mountains. And so, yeah, we've kind of gotten to become better partners since then. And then back in October, when I was starting to put this together for real, I sent him a message with the photo again and was like, "Hey, you interested in going to India in the spring?" And right away, like, you see the bubbles, and then he replies, he's like, "Yep, I'm in." And a couple days later, I texted him again and I was like, "Hey, this is actually kind of coming together. Like, are you willing to go to India for a month this spring?" I'm serious.
Yeah.
And then he texted back right away, like, "Yes, I'm 100% in." And I was like, "Sweet." So,
Hell yeah.
So that was pretty cool. Yeah. So both those guys, it was just, it's easy because you have people that you're not worried about when you're in the mountains. Like you're not thinking about, oh, can they do it? Are they going to be okay? What are they thinking? You're just like, all right, sweet. We're all focused on this same task and we're going to be able to get it done together. And then the fourth guy that came with us, we wanted a photographer. I've got a good friend in Canmore named Justin Bruns. He's an awesome photographer. He was with the Sherpas guys last year filming Laliste in Pakistan. So he had some Himalayan experience. And he's an aspirant guide. So just a like total mountain ninja. And when I called him and was like, "Hey, got a gig for you in India, try to do some skiing," he was like, "Yep, that sounds good."
Yeah, that's a pretty sweet gig.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, so like you're getting there, you've got your crew, you've got the logistics and all the planning done, and you're in India. Like I'm wondering things like what's, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of like a little bit ambiguous and get so complicated whenever you're talking about snow safety and stuff. But maybe if you have like some tips or tricks or just your approach to like looking at the weather, what is the difference? Like how are you getting weather in the Himalaya? What your approach to like snow safety is, maybe just anything like that, and kind of like more so in mind of like the viewer, like some stoked skier or climber who's listening to this, like maybe some things that they can get out of that.
Yeah, well, I'll dial it back a little bit from the Himalaya, but I ski 130 days a year, and a lot of that is in avalanche terrain and in avalanche conditions. Like I'm a big believer that like even high avalanche conditions, you can find good skiing and you can find safe skiing. But we also do a lot of skiing in considerable or moderate conditions that I think I would consider somewhat risky or fairly risky because there's 50 centimeters of fresh snow and you're skiing steep trees and that kind of thing. And so even like kind of small avalanches can be pretty dangerous. Um, and the more experienced I've become, the more basically scared of avalanches I am. I've lost plenty of friends in the mountains and seen a lot of crazy avalanches that didn't kill people kind of miraculously. And I've been very lucky not to have a serious incident myself, but I'm pretty pretty scared of avalanches, and I really don't want to die in an avalanche. So we take it pretty seriously, and again, this like all wraps back around to having an amazing group of partners, and that also kind of like the partner / mentors who also want to take it really seriously, and so we're always pretty much skiing together. And so we're relatively on the same page. When we're skiing, we have kind of our systems and our communication styles that are pretty dialed. There's not a whole lot of like yelling going on. It's pretty streamlined, just like some chirps and whoops, and we know where everybody is and what's going on. Or we're using radios or something like that. And so, and then that translates over to avalanche practice as well. And so I think a lot of people will take an AST1 and an AST2. I don't know what the American equivalent is, but it's similar, like the avalanche skills training. And then kind of like, that's it, like, sweet, I did the class, now I'm good to go. And for me, now having kind of done a bit more practice, I'm like, oh my God, like you forget how to do stuff. You go out of practice. It's not a learn it once and kind of it's there forever skill. It's something that needs to be developed and can be refined as new things are learned about how we do these rescues and all that stuff. And so then you look at like the heli ski guiding industry and how they kind of do this stuff, and they do really, really serious practice and skill development, and they're learning like the new best practices every year and all that stuff. Because friggin' heli skiing, there's avalanches all the time. Like you don't really hear about it, but there's so many accidents. It's crazy. But those guides are just so dialed and so good at that. And so for me, it was like, oh, okay, we need to be in that same space because we're exposing ourselves to similar amounts of risk. And so we need to be at that same level of preparedness. And so the last few years, actually, not only have we kind of practiced on our own, but every year at the beginning of the season, we organize with a guide here in town who's also one of our buddies. And we do a day of avalanche training with him. And so it's not specifically a course, but he's basically just setting up routines, and we're running through these drills like as if it were the real deal in groups. And for me, this has been like a totally mind-opening kind of experience, because not only am I learning new skills, but all of a sudden, like, I'm realizing how I use my beacon. Like there's really fine nuance to how you do this. And it only comes through practice, and how you shovel snow when you're digging and all that stuff. And so, even just after the first year, we were like, okay, this is something we're going to do every single year from here on out, that we're skiing and make this happen. And I really can't recommend that enough. It kind of blows my mind that guides don't offer something like this, like a it's not an AST 2 plus, but I feel like once you've done AST 2, the next step for a lot of people is to go to in Canada, we call it OPS, which is like, if you want to become a forecaster or something, you go to ops level 1 and level 2. But that doesn't make sense for a recreational skier. Like, I don't need to learn how to, do all these super fine snow science stuff. I just need to know how to dig my buddy out really fast and take care of some of these big concepts. And so I feel like guides should be offering, that 1 day refresher course for avalanche for the experienced skier. It doesn't matter whether you're, 1 year out of your AST or you're, 20 years into a pro career. I feel like this stuff is so important. And so, yeah, that's my divergent there. But yeah, for me, like, that's the most important skill to kind of be constantly sharpening. And we're pretty serious about that. And again, like, I would count myself very lucky to have partners that are kind of on that same page.
For sure. I think those are some really interesting points you brought up. Like, for me personally, like, snow terrifies me, like dying in an avalanche. And part of that is the fact that it's just so volatile. And the other part is like my ignorance to the median. Like, I don't have a lot of snow safety training or any of that stuff. And because I understand my ignorance in this department, I'm especially terrified of that.
Totally.
So I think like I think that's a really interesting point as well that you brought up with just like getting a guide to like cater a specific course to you. Like, I've done that a couple times, not for snow safety, but for like climbing related things. And yeah, It's just like, it's really interesting that like most of the time people adhere to this structure of like, okay, I need to look up the guided course, and then, oh, this is the course they're offering, or they're offering this course. And it's like, no, you can just go talk to a guide and then be like, I need to focus on these skills and learn these skills. And then the last thing you touched on, I think like we've talked about this before, but like it's kind of analogous to like CPR training, right? It's like, you don't just get certified once. It's like every single year, this is a skill. It's important. It's for saving lives, let alone like your own life or your partner's life. You want to recertify those things all the time and have those kind of skills like ready and present, right? Like a good buddy of mine, Luke, really, really great guy, but we were kind of talking, like, I used to work at Mech. And so, like, it's so easy to get like techie and into gear, and obviously like avalanche packs, people are so like fascinated by. And his kind of approach is always like always choose more snow safety training over like an Avi pack. He's like, if you're going to have the choice between getting an Avi pack or spending like 2 days out with a guide, learning more about like avalanche safety and stuff. Because that was his approach. So, and I think it makes total sense. Like, ultimately, the best way to not die in an avalanche is to not get in an avalanche.
Not be in one.
Yeah, right.
Totally.
So yeah, I just think that's pretty fascinating. Have you seen the movie?
Totally.
Is it Solving for Z? You know what I'm talking about? No.
No.
Oh, it's this Patagonia movie about this guide in the Tetons. I forget his name. I'm totally butchering this, but for anybody listening, they can look it up. Really, really cool, super rad ski movie. And this guy's just this pretty much like totally crusher, awesome ski guide in there. And I think he facilitated like a lot of pros who wanted to go in the area and ski. And the documentary kind of ends with him like being caught in an avalanche. And, like, sure enough, it's just like, it can happen to anybody. Right. So yeah, it's pretty crazy, man.
Yeah. And that's part of the thing. Like, like you say, the best way to not die in an avalanche is to not get caught in one. But realistically, we're not that good at predicting them. We're okay, but avalanches still happen, and pros get caught in them all the time, like all the time. And that kind of sucks. And so, yeah, like, you want to develop those skills for predicting as best you can. And a huge component of that just comes from experience, like from spending time in the mountains. And so, every day that you're poking your ski pole into the snow and feeling for conditions, or climbing, through, on your way to an ice climb, whatever, all that stuff adds up to helping you forecast. But in the end, it does also come down to your buddies being able to dig you out really fast. And so, yeah.
Also, the avalanche not being that big.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we kind of like jumped around here a little bit, but I was wondering if we could just kind of jump back to the Himalaya real quick, and just like
Right.
as far as like actually like how the trip went, like, and I hate the word successful because like the idea of like not summiting or something doesn't mean the trip wasn't a success. But you know, like how was that experience and that like skiing for you guys? And also like what did you do for you know, acclimation?
Yeah.
Real quick, Max. I'm sorry
Yeah,
to
it's all
jump
good.
in
It's all
here.
good.
I wanted to at some point, you know, answer this question. I want you, if you can, to try to paint the picture in the eyes of a climber of the route from start to finish. You know, like what was the approach to get up to the top? How far were you going? What were the objective hazards? Kind of like what was the route
Right.
in the view of a climber? So kind of if you can mix those two together, that'd be awesome.
Okay. Sorry. So keep me on track here as I wander around this question. But to kind of roll back, I think previously you were asking when the avalanche stuff came up, about how we treated that in the Himalayas. And so one point that I kind of wanted to bring up related to that is leading into this trip, I knew how challenging, just the logistics and all this stuff were going to be going to the Himalaya. Like a lot of people say, you're probably not going to be super successful. Like climbing in the Himalayas is hard, skiing's even harder. Have your expectations tempered and all that stuff. And I'm like, yeah. And I think I did a reasonably good job of that. But in hindsight, I look back at the months before the trip and I'm like, okay, I need to dial in my, steep turn, like make sure I can feel comfortable on firm snow when I'm making a super steep jump turn. And I should, be building lots of anchors. So I'm comfortable building anchors and stuff like that. And I focused on some of these kind of like pinnacle technical skills. And in reality, the crux of the trip was when I was like sitting on a boulder in the middle of this moraine in this giant glacier area, and a couple of our porters are telling me like, oh, and there's like a storm coming in, it's starting to rain, and I'm all by myself. Like half the team is in front of us, half the team is behind, and some of the porters are like, we don't really like this, we're gonna go home. And I'm sitting there like, what the fuck? Like, what do I do now? So like all this time we spent preparing for like the top 1% of our trip, when in reality, like it was the totality of the trip that was actually really challenging, and the pure technical skills were like almost unimportant. But that was a big realization kind of in the moment. I was like, whoa, that was stupid. I didn't need to worry about any of that stuff. But okay, so to take it back, so we flew into Delhi, the big city in India. It's crazy. There's people everywhere. In India, there's always people everywhere. There's a lot of people, and we, like I said, we were kind of traveling a little bit luxury. We had people that met us at the airport and basically escorted us around India the entire time. And so we had a bus that carried us around. It didn't have suspension or very good brakes or much of a transmission, but it was still our own bus. So that was sweet. And then you also have a liaison officer with you in India. So, and I think it's the same in Pakistan. But it was previously an army officer that would go on the expedition with you, and now it's just a person that's appointed by the IMF. And so we were unsure of how that was going to go, like what the liaison officer would be like. Is he going to be super serious about the rules, or was he going to be like a fun guy that wanted to just go climbing? We didn't know. But anyway, we met all our guys, hopped in the bus, and then it's a day drive from Delhi to a town called Rishikesh, which is on the Ganges, super famous, kind of a cool zone. And then from there, so that was all flat. Then from Rishikesh to another town called Uttarkashi was like classic Himalayan switchbacking up these roads, in these just crazy valleys, kind of what you imagine in the foothills of the Himalayas. And then from Uttarkashi to Gangotri, the roadhead, was the like classic super steep wall, road kind of chipped out of the mountain, gravel, one lane, like cars coming at each other, and then somebody has to back up and like, go along the cliff. It's crazy, and super bumpy. And the
that seems
road
really
just washes
sketchy.
out every year.
Like when you see like footage of those kind of things, like I always think of like, it's funny because you think of like the climb and things like freaking out, but you're like looking at the drive and I'm like, man, that seems terrifying.
Oh, for sure. Driving is much more dangerous than climbing. I mean, yeah, I don't know. Luckily we were in a bus, so we were kind of going slower, but yeah, also you feel like you're way further off the ground and you're like looking down the canyon at the like burnt out.
Yeah, are there just like
bus.
a grave?
Oh yeah,
are there like a graveyard of cars at the bottom of the valley?
Yeah, occasionally.
Oh shit!
So that was kind of our first like day where we're like, whoa, this is getting a bit more real, and that was where we got the glimpses of the Himalayas and stuff. Because in the valley, it's super like lots of air pollution. They burn wood fires, so you can't see anything, unfortunately. But then once you climb up kind of above Uttarkashi, above 1,500 meters, you start to see blue sky and stuff, and the hills popping out. So 4 days of driving. Yeah, 4 days of driving. And then we get to the roadhead, and yeah, so they're rebuilding everything because it washes out every year in the monsoon. And they have to build it all before this festival starts because thousands and tens of thousands of people come to this festival in Gangotri. So they're like frantically rebuilding the road and all these washouts and stuff. And you're just like driving over it as they're building it. There's no like no single lane alternating traffic or anything like that. It's just giver as the like digger is scooping gravel off the slope above or whatever. But we rolled into Gangotri, and we were actually on a pretty limited time frame. We only had a month in country because of our visas. India had changed their visa from being a 6-month visa to a 1-month visa, and that's now changed. Like it changed while we were in India back to the original one, the pre-COVID one. But we were like on this time frame. And so we rolled into Gangotri. I think we had a day there in town to repack our gear. And then our porters met us, and then we were off up the valley. And so we spent one day on the main tourist trail, which is kind of like, like kind of classic national park, nice, not quite double wide, but like a well-maintained trail. And they were rebuilding that as well. And yeah, it was in really good shape. A couple of the guys got sick the night before.
I was going to ask,
suffering. Yeah. I mean, everybody, I think, like you get a certain level of GI issues when you travel to a country like that. Like kind of baseline diarrhea is pretty normal. And so we were all like suffering a little bit to that point.
Yeah.
But
what is it coming from? The water, the food?
Bacteria,
all the above.
Yeah,
all of the above.
Yeah.
Are you drinking out of bottled water, or where's the water coming from?
Yeah, either bottled water or filtered water.
It's still sus, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, and like you don't know
just different microbes and different things, right? It's like
yeah, what's on the vegetables, how well they got cooked, what's in the chicken, how they washed the dishes. It could just be that they washed the plate in like the river. Our guys, so we had a cook with us and an assistant cook, and they were they were very good. But we were still eating in roadside stops and stuff on the way there. So they would like go into the restaurant and check it out, and then be like, "Yes, we can eat here," and stuff like that. But it was still, you're still kind of at the mercy of your stomach and what happens. So that first night when we were to start hiking, 2 of the guys got like viral infections and really, really sick. And so that was a rough day of hiking, because it was like on this super mellow, like barely any grade tourist trail. And, our team is just like stumbling up this trail with super light packs too, because the porters, we had 40 porters. We had this big train of porters because as soon as you start adding, skis and then all that stuff on top of the climbing gear, and then, the liaison officer and then the cook and the guy and all this, like, it adds up super fast. So you end up with like this huge train of porters. which is kind of funny. It's just crazy to think about. I was like, what? But then you see them and you're like, oh yeah, that's all our stuff.
Wow.
And so we made it into a small village kind of on this trail, spent the night there. The guys felt a little better, so we knew we could keep going. And then the next day we were going to go off the trail, and we had to cross the Ganges, which most like the tourists don't do, and then head up this side valley to the glacier that we were staying on. And so our porters and the local guide didn't want to go further up the trail and then cross at a cable car. They wanted to ford the river. And they were like, oh, it's early. It's still spring. The major runoff hasn't started. We can ford it. It'll save us 6 hours or something. And I was like, all right, well, you guys are the locals. So the next morning we wake up and, get our camp packed up and walk over to the river because we camped right next to it. And, it looked low, but not like it wasn't a creek. It was definitely still a river.
Yeah.
Big boulders and stuff. And I'm like, okay, well, let's try it and see, and we can decide. And the head porter just like gives her, he had a full load. Like he didn't try it without the load. He just like, which maybe like held him down a bit better.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
because he's like
yeah.
this, 5 foot tall Nepali guy, probably weighed like 85 pounds. But he had two, these guys were carrying, some of them were carrying double loads. So like, the 100-liter expedition devils,
just
two
unreal.
of those stuffed, and they're just carrying it with one
Jeez.
strap over their forehead. So it's like, it's full on.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Or big like propane tanks and stuff like that. It's just like, okay. So anyway, he like goes in and he makes it most of the way across, and then like the far side was where the current was, and we see him like wobble, and I'm like, oh my God, this is where someone like dies, like if he gets swept under, not only do we lose all our tents and all that stuff, but like a freaking person dies. Like this is, but he wobbles, kind of like stumbles, and then catches it, and then like fully sticks it on the other side of the bank. And then all the porters on our side are like, yeah, and cheering. And they're like, let's go. And I'm like, no, hold on. We're going to put up a hand line. Like we're going to stretch a rope across. And so we got that going. And then, yeah, like, there's 40 dudes in their underwear crossing this river at 7 a.m. and I'm just like, oh my God, what are we getting ourselves into? Like, this is a little bit more real. I think, when you're trekking to Everest, it's like a pretty like, smooth experience, whereas I was like,
tea houses and leisure,
we're going into the wild. So that was a cool feeling. But then from there we headed up the river a bit more, and then turned up this glacier valley. And at this point we're like a little bit starting to be concerned that we hadn't seen snow yet, because we had planned on camping on snow on this glacier. And we're like, oh, that's a little weird, but maybe it's a little dry. And then a little bit after that started storming. We're super spread out because some porters are fast, some porters are slow. And that's where I had that kind of moment where I'm sitting on this rock like, oh no, what is going on? But get up to about, I think we're at 4,200 meters. So the town was at 3,000 meters. Base camp was at 42 or 43. And our cook and LO, they found a kind of sandy, grassy spot in this, like just in the moraine, basically at the end of the glacier. I don't know if we were on ground. So we're right at the base of the dry glacier. And they're like, this is it. This is our spot. And we're kind of like, okay, well, whatever you say, you guys know it better than we do. And in hindsight, I wish we had gone another kilometer or two up the glacier, but in the end, it was okay. So we had this kind of like dusty, rocky spot on the moraine there, and there's a nice little creek running next to us. And it was funny because, we're like, oh yeah, perfect, right by a creek. That'll be convenient. We'll have water. We won't have to melt snow or anything. But the creek made like a lot of noise. And basically until I came back to Canada, it was just constantly noisy. Like when you're in Delhi, in the village, in base camp, it was just like there was always noise. And I like was just using my earplugs religiously. But yeah, so we set up camp there. That was going to be our spot for like 2.5 weeks, kind of depending on how things went. And then from there, the glacier kind of wove its way up like a pretty gentle valley. And it was just pure like dry rock glacier. So, bare ice with lots of rock on top of it. You could feel the ice, but we wouldn't wear crampons or anything on it. And then that went up to about 4,500 meters where we put advanced base camp. So it took us a day to carry loads up to ABC at the base of an ice fall. And the ice fall was the big question mark of the trip. And so we had seen in the FatMap imagery, and actually FatMap got us updated imagery for that area. And so we had pretty good like idea of what the zone looked like. And I'd also talked to a pair of British climbers that had attempted the route as a climbing route back in the 90s, but they didn't quite summit. And so we knew this icefall was there. We knew it might be a little bit challenging, but we figured we could probably find a way up one of the sides or something. But with like literally no snow on the glacier, the icefall was pretty much an icefall. You can imagine like a valley coming to like a horseshoe end, like cliff, and then just a tongue of ice kind of spilling over it with seracs and stuff kind of ringing the top. And so the right side of the cliff was just constantly serac fall. And then the ice fall itself kind of stuck out. So we're looking at it like, okay, it's less than vertical, which is good, but it has seracs all over it and chunks, above it and all that kind of stuff. And it's just littered with ice at the bottom. But we're like, well, we got to go have a look at it and see how that kind of goes, because that leads to the upper glacier, which then is a long, gentle glacier to the base of the face that we wanted to climb, the steep face. And the peak. And we still hadn't seen the peak at this point either. It was like around the corner of the glacier. Like we had no clue. So a few days getting sorted there. On the question of altitude, going from 3,000 to 43 was the worst day for me. I got a bit sick at base camp the first night. And it was funny because it was like a super stressful day, like I'd kind of said, and like very effortful. And finally, like pretty late at night, lay down in bed and was trying to go to sleep. And I remember I was kind of like, I was breathing super fast and shallow. Like it was like, and I'm laying there and I was like, oh, I've been laying here for like 10 minutes. I'm not still just like, breathing from what I was doing.
Tired, yeah.
Something's wrong.
This is how I exist now.
We pulled out the pulse oximeter and my SAT was like 79. Which is like super really low.
Yeah.
It should have been 90 or something. And so that was like, oh shit. But there was just that one night that I was sick and everybody else was feeling fine. But that was a big jump, going 12 or 1,300 meters at that altitude is a lot. It'd be like, going and camping on the summit of Mount Baker or Mount Rainier from sea level here kind of thing. So yeah, we established our ABC and then wanted to go have a look at the ice fall. And both Justin and I are pretty capable ice climbers. Like Justin's actually a very good ice climber. I can get up stuff. Paul is a generally a good climber all around, but not like he doesn't do a lot of ice leading. And then Tom has never led a pitch of ice in his life. But he did do some YouTubing when we were in town. So he was feeling pretty confident. So we go to the ice fall. Justin and I went to go just kind of for an exploratory climb to see if we get up it. And our plan was to fix ropes up the ice fall. We had 3 or 4 60-meter ropes that we could fix. And then that way the whole team could jug the lines to move loads up onto the upper glacier, because it was just not going to be practical to like fully belay out every time that we needed to bring loads up. So we were going to fix these ropes. And so, Paul and Tom kind of waved goodbye. We'd all scoped the ice fall together, and then the day before, and then we go to head up, and it was kind of like we were leaving for our funeral. The atmosphere was not great in camp. We were like, what the hell, guys? Like, show us some support here. But we head up, and we go up to the base, and we're just putting on our crampons, like, sitting on a rock kind of just outside of the icefall zone there, and looking up at it, and I was just like, oh my God, like there's just, those detached seracs ringing the entire top of the route, and you can see where they fall down the section that we would want to climb and stuff like that. And I'm like, man, that looks shitty. Like, I know you and I can climb this pretty quickly and get up and down this, but I don't know if we can do this, multiple times. And then Justin was like, oh, let's fly the drone. And because we had two little drones with us for photos and stuff. And so he like fires it up, blasts up to the top of the icefall, and does a loop around it. And we're kind of looking at the seracs hanging over it, and like, oh my God, that looks terrible. And then he's like, oh, I think I could fly to the peak from here, if we're lucky. And I was like, oh yeah, definitely do that. And so he kind of cruises up the glacier, and above 5,000 meters, like the drone is not operating at its optimal.
I was just wondering that, like, so rotors, like,
beeping, power load reach and all that stuff. And we're like, ooh, hopefully it survives. But he comes around the corner, and yeah, we got the full view of the face. And it was just blue ice, like pure blue ice, and then old gray ice, and like no snow whatsoever. And so he's sitting there with his jacket over his head, because it's like super sunny, and you can't fly the drone without doing that. And so, I'm kind of sitting there next to him, like looking at the sky and stuff. And then he's like, oh no. And, I stick my head under the jacket and looking at the screen, and I see this face, and I'm just like, well, that kind of solves it for us. Like, we're obviously not going to ski that. And so there's really no point in committing the team to going up and down this like really serious hazard. I was like, I think I'm going to make the call right now. And Justin was like, yeah, I think that's the only decision. And so we called the other guys on the radio, and we're like, hey guys, we actually got to see the mountain. We're looking at the seracs on the peak, or on the icefall, and it just doesn't go. Like, we're not going to be able to do it. And they were both like, oh, thank God. So that was funny, because that was like day 3 in base camp, of this 2.5 week trip. And the thing is, like, we kind of assumed, okay, maybe we won't get to ski the face for whatever reason, but there'll be other stuff to ski. There'll be other things we can do. But where there should have been 5 feet of snow on this glacier, there was none. And so there was no like mini golf, there was no other objectives that really kind of jumped out at us. And so, the next day we're kind of thinking about this, and we're like, oh my God, like, what are we going to do now? And luckily we did have one plan B, which is another peak called Manda 2. That was kind of like, our original plan was at the end of the glacier. Our plan B, there's a couloir that goes off from the base of the icefall. So we didn't need to climb the icefall to head up towards Manda 2. And it's still a big peak, looks cool. Didn't know if it had been climbed by that route or not, but it seemed worth trying. And so we're like, okay, we're going to pivot, and we're going to refocus our efforts on Manda 2. And so basing out of that ABC, we made 2 attempts, and both attempts didn't get super far. So it turns out we were in India in like one of their bigger heat waves in northern India in some time. And so where we should have been in, like I said, 5 feet of snow on the glacier and pretty cold temperatures, it was like -2 overnight and that kind of thing at best, and no snow. And so both attempts we made, the first one of the guys got a bit altitude sick and was having trouble kind of like staying balanced. And I think that was at about 5,800 meters, which is a pretty big jump. And then the second attempt we made was, it didn't freeze overnight. So we started at like midnight, slept most of the afternoon in ABC, and then got up and left. And it just didn't freeze. And so we're booting up this entrance couloir into into kind of the funnel of the couloir, and then above that it opens back up into this giant face, like this big bowl, up to like 6,900 meters. And I'm like, I was at the back of the group at this point, and I was punching through and like going to my knees and my hip in this like slushy snow, and I was like, all right guys, this is just not safe. Like, we can't climb in this kind of snow, and it's not getting better. Like, it's only getting warmer.
Yeah.
So that was our second attempt. We didn't get quite as high as the first one, but yeah, so that was definitely a bummer. And that kind of speaks to your kind of question about success. Like, objectively, our trip was like an utter failure. Like, we didn't succeed on plan A or B or C, which sucks. Obviously, like, I would much rather ski than R and like send it and, have the summit photo and all that stuff, like all the glory. But ultimately we did learn a ton. Like, it was a hell of an intro trip to the Himalayas. And so I think for me, that was almost, I won't say it was more important, but it was definitely something I expected, and really valuable. Like, now I feel like I could go back and all those kind of minor complications and logistical challenges and all that stuff, like, I feel much more confident that I could just show up and kind of handle that. So lots of learnings, I guess. So in that sense, the trip was absolutely a success. And then also, it was still a hell of a time. Like, even when we bailed on the route, we're sitting in this couloir and like an objectively very scary spot. And we're like, well, we're going to turn around, but before we do, we're going to like sit down. Tom had a little flask of whiskey that he had brought. We clicked off our headlamps. We're sitting in our puffy suits and like looking out at the stars, above the Himalayan peaks around us, like above Meru and Shivling and stuff. And it was like, well, this is pretty rad. Like, not too many people have the opportunity to even try to go skiing in the Himalayas. And so to have that chance definitely makes it a success.
Yeah, for sure, man. I think that's more of like a common thread nowadays, right? Is like obviously the polished finished product, like you talked about, like at the summit photo, is like really sick and great. But I think the vast majority of like climbing, ski mountaineering, skiing, it's really like all about like failure and like dealing with failure. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's the majority of climbing. And so I think like those kind of experiences, not that I've had one like you're talking about, but in general, just experiences like that, like, you actually have to enjoy the process, right? And if all you're trying to do is just get like the shiny photo at the top, you're really going to miss a lot out of that. And I think, like you're saying, like, you've learned a lot from this experience. It was a super cool experience. And, it's only going to set you up for the next kind of trip you're going on, which I think is really, really cool. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, it was cool that you took the time to be present and to like experience what was around you. And I think a lot of people can miss that. A lot of people are like, all right, let's just go down, and like miss that cool opportunity to just take it all in.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's pretty awesome.
For sure. I'm definitely like a very motivated and movement oriented person. And that's just my style of moving in the mountains too, is like moving quickly. That's my racing background. I like trail running. I like skiing. And so it's just constant movement, but it is certainly nice to like take in the view once in a while. And don't get me wrong, like, I would much prefer to have summited and to have done the rad stuff and like gotten the glory and,
for sure. Yeah.
All that kind of stuff. And I do, like, I roll my eyes real hard when people are like, oh, it's not about the objective, it's about the journey and all that stuff. Like, I don't buy that for 1 second. If you're talking about it, the objective does matter to you. But certainly, like, I think you have to enjoy all of it. You can still want to be successful and be motivated, and that's totally fine. But you also have to enjoy the rest of it. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure, man. I think that's
did you see any huge seracs or anything fall while you were out there?
Oh yeah, totally. Massive avalanches. Like, early in the trip, it did snow, like more or less a dusting. But when there's 3,000 meters of slope, that's accumulating and dusting, you can still get some pretty wild avalanches. But the ice fall, yeah, like camping in ABC was kind of horrifying because we had the ice fall on one side that was constantly spitting seracs, and then on either side of the glacier was the moraine, and it was like a friggin' 300-meter moraine wall that was just constantly spitting out rocks. And so like we don't get that so much in BC, those big steep moraine walls, but every once in a while you find them. But in the Himalaya, like because those glaciers are so old and so deep, and now are receding so much, the moraine walls are enormous. And so laying in my tent, like, you know, I knew I'm in the middle of this like big wide glacier and I'm totally far away from that, but you just hear these like massive like car-sized rocks come tumbling down the moraine in the middle of the night, and you're like, what the fuck was that? So like earplugs are the key. I think earplugs and eye shade are like by far the most important.
Yeah. Could you see like sparks and stuff coming off the rocks as they're coming down the moraines?
Oh yeah.
Was it like, yeah, that's crazy, man. Do you have any footage or anything of that particular carnage?
I don't know if we took much of those moraines because we were more just like trying to sleep at that point. I mean, definitely.
Yeah.
We've got a few videos of us trundling rocks down moraines as we're walking to and from camps and stuff. But yeah.
I'm wondering, crazy. Did you guys bring any like high altitude medication with you or anything like that?
Oh yeah. We had kind of the whole gamut. I mean, the main two are Diamox and dexamethasone. So
totally, yeah.
Any oxygen canisters?
No.
Yeah.
Nice.
What do you think of like skiing an 8,000 meter peak with O2? I know you said you're not interested in that in general, but I mean, like, what do you think of in general, like climbing with oxygen?
I mean, I'm kind of indifferent to it. It seems like it's a huge hassle. I think, yeah, like if that's what you need to do to go up there and do your thing, that's fine with me. I probably wouldn't choose to do it myself. It's hard to say unless you're in that situation. Like if next year I was offered a trip to an 8,000er on like an expedition like that, I don't know. I think personally I would rather try it without, but yeah, I don't know. Like even the guys that go without on those peaks, like there's just so much of a safety net around you anyway. I don't even know how much you can really say like that's like, it's obviously different, physiologically you're at a major disadvantage, but I think for the people that are climbing without oxygen, as soon as they decide like, oh, this is too hard, they can grab oxygen, even if they're not bringing it up there. And so that alone, like mentally is a pretty big safety net. And, same goes for fixed ropes and all that kind of stuff. And so that's where like, to me, it's kind of like, well, yeah, it's cool. And, you did a thing and physiologically definitely challenging, but psychologically, it's a lot different than being on a remote peak all by yourself. So I look to the guys that are climbing hard routes in Alaska or hard routes in the Himalayas without oxygen, alpine style, like on remote peaks as just, I mean, they're playing it's not even comparable. Like it's a totally different game. So.
Yeah, totally. Did you see that? I think it was like Jackson Marvel and someone else. They did like the Slovak Direct in under like 30 hours. That was pretty wild. Yeah, that's like a really coveted, pretty cool route. I've been interested in that. Like I'm a huge fan of Steve House, and so I know about like their original like 60-hour push they did on that. And so to get it done in like 30 hours was pretty unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, rad stuff is still happening. Like that's the other thing. You could slog your way up an 8,000er with oxygen, but the guys that are really pushing the limits, I think that's pretty rad, and it's going down all the time. There's a big route climbed on Changabang, and a couple other peaks got climbed this Himalayan season because the weather was so good. And then tons of stuff happened in Alaska. I wasn't really around for it, but now I've kind of seen a few things that's trickling out. So yeah, it's pretty rad.
For sure. I think it's also like perspective, right? It's like what's harder, like being oxygenless, like, slogging up a steep like hillside or mountainside, or like climbing WI6 at like 5,500 meters. You know what I mean? It's like I haven't done either of those things, so I'm really not one to like comment, but like I feel like there's probably an argument to say like there's a lot of people who'd rather be slogging up the mountainside than trying to climb WI6 at like, 5,500 meters. So yeah, it's definitely all just perspective, and context matters a lot.
Totally.
Yeah, I mean, like we're an hour and a half into this, so I'm wondering if like we can kind of just like switch gears a little bit here. And I think like something Kyle and I were talking about is like, so you were saying like, you've got your master's in exercise physiology right now, and you're a PhD candidate, I believe, right?
I finished my PhD.
Really? Yeah. Wow, man, congrats. Crazy. Yeah. Maybe a little bit about your experience, about what you're studying, because it's so relevant, but then also how, as an athlete, do you manage your time? You know what I mean? Like how do you have the time to do the things that you do, to study, to do all these things? Like maybe if we can dive a little bit into that. Yeah.
I think my PhD supervisor was probably the most patient ever in history. But it took me 8.5 years to do my PhD. So that would be a big part of it. Every season that I was competing on the national team, I took leaves of absence from my program, basically for the winter. And yeah, my supervisor was okay with that, which is unusual for sure. But also he's a skier and climber as well, and that's the reason I chose that program. So he was really like an integral part, I would say, in both my academic career and my athletic career. He kind of enabled that. But being a student, like, it's kind of a convenient side project to being or like it works well with being an athlete, I should say. A lot of what I did, like I did a lot of lab experiments. And so I did need to spend time at the university, but as a student, like a lot of what you're doing is writing proposals or writing results. And you can do that from anywhere, whether it's, the Chamonix office in McDonald's or Squamish, like it doesn't really matter as long as you're writing. And so you can write at night, you can write in the morning, like you can write when you're tired. Yeah, for me, it was like it was almost like kind of a non-question. Like I was going to do stuff in the mountains. And so I had to make sure my academic program, like, allowed that to happen. Otherwise I wouldn't have finished. Like I could never have finished my PhD if I had to be in the office every day, day in and day out. Like I would have quit.
And so I guess for like people who aren't like, who, haven't like read about you or don't know about you, like maybe you want to just give like a quick breakdown on like what your PhD was on and like, yeah, a little bit about that.
Yeah. I came to UBC mostly interested in kind of continuing that exercise physiology stream that I started in Vermont in my undergrad. And I knew that I was interested in doing research. And I knew I was interested in altitude and things like that. And so, unfortunately, compared to like cancer and things like that, there's not a lot of money into high altitude research unless you're in the Army. And I'm not very military, focused. But there is still like kind of a niche to carve out there. And initially I was looking at purely altitude illness. So my master's was looking at high altitude pulmonary edema. And there's actually a very similar illness called immersion pulmonary edema that happens to swimmers and divers. And so for my master's, I was comparing those two and trying to see if the mechanism of the edema was similar. And so then going into my PhD, I wanted to do similar stuff. And I actually, because of that master's project, was doing a bit of actual just like purely diving research. Even though I'm not a diver by any stretch, I'm not really a water person. But they do cool stuff. And again, there's military resources behind it. So I was working a bit in Toronto, where they have the Canadian clearance divers are based out of there. And so that was actually pretty interesting. And they have like really cool equipment and stuff. But after doing that for a couple of years, I was like, oh, I don't really want to work for the military, and I'm not a diver, nor do I have any interest in doing diving stuff. So I changed there back to focusing more on high altitude. And obviously, as an athlete, it was like, okay, how can I look into performance and how that relates to altitude? And a big question that I had was, if we're all 10K runners and we live at sea level, and then we go to compete at 2,000 meters, at altitude, kind of, we're all going to do worse than we would at altitude, or at sea level, excuse me. We're going to run a little bit slower, but one of us might run a minute slower, one of us might run 10 seconds slower, one might run 3 minutes slower. There's not like a really good way to figure out how altitude affects individuals differently, especially relating to performance. And same goes, you could argue for climbing. Like, some people experience altitude illness much more severely or much earlier than other people. And so we don't know what accounts for that inter-individual variability. And that's what I wanted to look into. Unfortunately, all the things that I hypothesized as factors turned out not to be major factors. And so I don't have any really good insights other than it's probably not the stuff that I studied. I think the real answer is there's a whole bunch of things that go into how we respond to altitude. Like, if you imagine, a bank of switches, you want to have like all those switches flicked in your favor. Most people probably have half on and half off. And some people have all of them on and they're like superheroes at altitude. And some people have all of them off and they're just like doomed. But yeah.
Super
That's
cool,
the quick
man.
summary.
Yeah. No, fair enough. And I mean, obviously seems really, really useful if you're getting into more high altitude stuff and wanting to go to the Himalayas. So that's pretty cool, man.
Did you use any of your actual on-site experience up at high altitude in your research and in your schooling? Like, were you able to combine your sport and your schooling?
Effectively, no. None of the competing I was doing or anything was relevant for like data collection. That was all kind of lab-based stuff. But the idea of like, how come I feel way shittier than my partner that I train with every day, in Squamish, and now we're in the Alps and he's crushing, or vice versa. So that kind of stuff, like, it does inspire you. And then, yeah, like when you're in the mountains, and somebody's like, oh, my heart rate's really high and I have a pretty gnarly headache, what's going on? You're like, oh yeah, I know what that, like, read those symptoms before, kind of thing. So definitely like a little bit of carryover for sure.
Cool,
man.
Very cool.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of curious, what is your your annual training volume? Like, maybe if you want to like take us through a little bit about like your training and how you like ramp up your seasons, and particularly from like the aspect of like, someone listening to this, that they can try and absorb some information, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It does depend a little bit on how you want to count training. Like, if a mellow ski tour counts as training or not. I kind of think it does. Like, I think basically anything that it helps your aerobic base is going to be pretty useful. But then, like, I don't count like rock climbing as training. So yeah, that depends a little bit. But in terms of like aerobic hours, like about 1,000 hours a year lately. And that's been pretty consistent probably since college.
Wow. Holy shit.
But then,
yeah,
I mean, like maybe a little bit more depending on kind of the skiing, because ski touring, you can obviously like ski 7 hours a day or something. So it depends on how you kind of look at that, but I'd say like of effective training, about 1,000 hours. A season for me, I'm not so good at like practicing what I preach in terms of ideal training and stuff, and part of that is because I actually do kind of enjoy like all seasons. We're really lucky here on the coast because the summers are beautiful. We can go rock climbing, we can go trail running, we can go alpine climbing and running. It's rad in the summer. And then the falls, like, yeah, things kind of get gross weather-wise, and maybe it's not ideal, but then all of a sudden, like when it gets cold, the high peaks get snow and ice, and like we have a really sick alpine and mixed season here in Squamish and Whistler. Like you can climb some really outrageous routes high in the mountains in like October. Good hard mixed climbing, and then all those routes get covered in snow and disappear, and they turn into ski lines, and you have a rad winter. In December and January and stuff, like it just snows so much, and like that's that chief line. Like it snowed so much this season, in town, which is crazy, and we just ski so much POW, like almost to the point where it's like, oh my god, I just hope it stops snowing for a little while so we can like get up in the alpine and breathe a little bit. And then later in the season, it turns into ski mountaineering season, and we can ski big lines and get up in the alpine. And then spring rolls around, and it's like go to the Rockies, go to Alaska, go to the Himalaya, whatever. And then it's all of a sudden volcano season, and then pretty soon, you're back to trail running. So we're pretty lucky that we have all that. And then I'm just like, I just want to do it all, and have the most fun on each day, basically. So I'm not so great at kind of periodizing my training nowadays, now that I'm not competing. I'm kind of like psyched to just like go hard all year long, and then occasionally take like that mandatory week of rest. But I do try to rest when appropriate, and there's often like kind of a time later in the summer when it gets really hot here and the snow is melted out so much that the alpine routes aren't all that great. Like in August, I typically take a bit of a break. And then September, even late August, September, I'm generally kicking back into prepping for skiing, which is a lot of uphill training. So either we're really lucky again that we have a gondola here, so I can just like hike a vertical kilometer pretty direct and then take the gondola down and not have that beat on my legs. Or if it's been raining for 2 weeks straight and I just can't stand the idea of being wet again, going on a Stairmaster or something like that. And then also at about that same time of year, I switched to a fairly heavy strength training cycle. And that
this is actually something I was really, really curious about, is like your strength training, like less sport specific and more like foundational strength training and muscular endurance.
Totally. Stuff. Yeah. I mean, I like, obviously what I do is primarily requires an aerobic base. When days are 6 to 20 hours long, it's aerobic, but also like when you're booting up a 1,000-meter face, like if you imagine that, it's like doing box steps, right? Like it's doing 1,000 meters worth of box steps with a pack on. So you still need like pretty solid muscle endurance. And that really just comes from strength training. And so I lift at a gym here called Squamish Barbell. And they're like a powerlifting gym, which is hilarious because, it's me and a couple of my ski buddies that are like, I'm not a tiny guy, but I'm pretty skinny compared to the power lifters, which is funny. But they're like super psyched. They're like they think it's rad that we're trying. And then when they go and do their 1K run, we're cheering them on. So it's pretty fun. And yeah, so that's a pretty classic powerlifting phase for me, like focusing on squats and a lot of single leg stuff. I get a little bit of knee issues, especially with running. And so trying to kind of just protect that and offset, like, in the winter with skinning and hiking and stuff, glutes get so tight. So trying to offset that a bit and just get ahead of that stuff. And that strength phase usually takes me through December when the skiing starts getting really good, and then it's just too hard to like ski 7 hours or 8 hours a day and also strength train. It's just like it's too demanding.
sure.
So yeah.
Do you keep like a maintenance period where like you try and maintain like at least like a strength workout through the period, or are you just like once you've done your strength phase that kind of carries you a long enough period of time that you just
I wouldn't call it strength training. I just do I call it like a maintenance routine, and so that's like it's like clamshells and just some like unweighted single leg stuff. But it's not powerlifting like the main strength phase would be. Yeah, totally. I try to do that as much as I can. I mean, there are times in the season where that falls away as a priority, but totally.
Are you coached as an athlete?
No.
So,
no,
but
anymore.
But like, were you previously when you were competing and stuff were coached, right?
Oh, totally. Yeah, totally. And then, I mean, in the gym, I work with a strength coach there, but not an overall coach. It's just at my point, performance is no longer my priority. It's more just like keeping fitness high and maintaining, like functional performance, really. And so, and then just with 20 years of experience at this kind of stuff, like I can keep myself going to do stuff like this reasonably well. So
no, super cool, really interesting. I think are you familiar with like the Uphill Athlete and like Scott Johnston, those guys?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like I'm a huge fan of them. I really like their stuff. That's like kind of the majority of like the principles of like what I base like training and trying to do things off of. And I think he just like Scott in particular just has like so much really great practical advice. But one thing I've really been like adhering to is just like a lot of my friends who, whether they're like climbers or runners or skiers or anything, like none of them really do like much any like foundational strength work. And like we're not talking about like going to the gym and becoming a bodybuilder, right? Like we're talking about like good foundational strength work that's going to like increase bone density and tendon density and increase your strength reserve and reduce like having floppy legs on like really long days and stuff. Like really just good foundational stuff. And I don't know. It's something that I'm really interested in. Like, and there's even people I've been like, hey, you should be doing this, and then they just like will never go put any hours in the gym. And I just think that at a certain point, if you're only doing like your sport specific stuff or just constantly getting out, like inevitably you're working against yourself. And then like the fitter you are as an athlete, like someone like you who has like a 20-year base aerobically, like you can get away with a lot more and do a lot more than like someone who's like starting out, I think. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, totally. I mean, those Uphill Athlete guys are great. Scott's a former cross-country skier, so their whole training philosophy is based in the Norwegian cross-country ski model, which is what I kind of grew up in as well. But it's kind of like it's classic endurance training. And they just do a good job of translating that to mountain athletes. But yeah, to your point, like I wish I had dove into the strength training. I mean, I've been strength training my entire competitive career, but I wish I had gone as hard at it as I am now, 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. I would be a lot better off at this point, and I would have been a lot better off then. And that's certainly something that most runners and skiers and folks are missing. It takes time. Like you have to go to the gym and you have to pay for it, and you have to find a good gym. Like it doesn't work to do it at the 24-hour fitness place. You got to be at the place that's got the right group and all that kind of stuff. But once you find that, it's a huge payoff, and so it's worth it.
Yeah, for sure, man. Yeah, I think like on my end, kind of wrapping up here, I do have a few more questions, so I don't want to take you for too long because I know we're at like an hour and 46 minutes here, and I don't know, Kyle, if you have a few more here, but
yeah, no, Max carried man. Away. I'm all tapped out.
Yeah, well, I'm just wondering. Okay, so like what are some cool lines for like like someone who's like getting into ski mountaineering? They have like reasonable competency in the mountains here on the coast. what are some cool lines that like something you'd say they should be checking out?
Yeah, the Mathieu and Joffre group up on near Pemberton off the Duffy Lake Road are kind of like the really classic. I wouldn't call it like beginner because it's definitely like real skiing, but it is it's kind of like the first step into steep skiing, I would say. Like, yeah, they're fairly real, but they're still friendly. You could fall down it and not die, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so that zone is really good. And as soon as there's three really classic lines: the Aussie Couloir, the northeast face of Mathieu, and the north face of Slalak, which are kind of those classic intro routes. But as soon as you go off those and you look on the other sides of the peaks, there are some really gnarly steep lines that are no longer intro lines and require rappelling and cornice management and all that kind of stuff. And so, even without kind of naming stuff, like if you just look at FatMap for those peaks and look on the backsides and start thinking like, oh, does that Couloir link? How do we get into that? That's where developing those skills goes. And so that's kind of how you do it, really. The other zone, the next step up there from there, I would say, is around Wedgemount Lake and Wedge Peak in Whistler. And that's a super sweet spot that has almost no traffic in the winter because it's a little bit harder to get to. But it is very steep and some really pretty rowdy lines. There's a couple more intro ones, but for the most part, they're pretty rad. And then in Squamish, I would say the area around Mount Garibaldi doesn't get nearly as much traffic as it should. The Neve Traverse gets a lot of traffic, and the classic northeast face of Garibaldi gets skied, but there are some really cool lines on every aspect of that peak that maybe get skied once every couple of years, kind of thing. So
yeah,
lots to explore there.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And I guess last thing, you were saying that you had, some things that were exciting you, and I'm wondering like what they are, what's in store for you, like this coming, at the end of this season or next season kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I did put a lot of mental effort into India and making sure that would go well, and yeah, just everything associated with that. So I kind of it was one of those things where we got back and I was like, oh shit, what now? Like, what's next? But ski season is mostly wrapped up here. I think hopefully I'll get out 1 or 2 more days, but the kind of the big cool stuff is probably mostly done. Transitioning into more like alpine climbing and alpine running. I think the Tantalus range here above town kind of has my heart for summer activities, and there's a couple things that I have left to do up there. A couple routes and I'm only missing one peak in the range that I haven't climbed yet, which is Red Tusk. Mostly because it's like a volcanic tross pile, but I do need to go tick that off, and then some other kind of fun running adventures. But mostly this time of year, like looking for alpine traversey climbs and that kind of thing. And then I have to figure out what I want to do next year in terms of skiing. I think that's been the other realization from this trip is skiing in the Himalayas. There's a really low likelihood of success, just period. Or even climbing in the Himalayas, let's put it that way, has a low likelihood of success. And then skiing is even less likely. And so I think the way that people are successful there, this is my impression because I am not successful there, but is that basically you keep beating your head against the wall and you go there year in and year out on multiple expeditions, and you dedicate your life to it. And there's, examples of incredible climbers in Canada and stuff that do this, and they go year in and year out, and some years they fail and some years they're successful. And it's not so much a measure of how good of a climber they are. It's kind of luck in terms of conditions and partners and all that kind of stuff. And so for me, I'm trying to decide, I'm really excited to go back. I definitely do want to, but I don't know if I want to dedicate my life to that. Like, there's a heck of a lot of cool stuff to do, even just like within 100 kilometers of my house, that is much lower cost and higher likelihood of success. But perhaps, the stuff in the Himalaya is like it's high cost, it's low likelihood of success, but then what's the reward? I don't know where that all like lines up for me. And if I want to be one of those guys that goes every year on a big expedition and leaves, I don't know if I want to leave my wife every year for a month and a half or 2 months. That's not super fun. But maybe I do. I don't know. It is a pretty cool place. So we'll see. I don't want to leave her. I would like to bring her with, but I may want to go do that. And so I got to figure that out.
Totally, man. Well, I think that's all I got on my end. I just want to say thanks so much for talking to us today and stuff. I really appreciate you taking the time, and it was great having a conversation with you.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening today. If you want to support us, please like and rate this podcast. As well, consider sharing this show with your friends. We want to hear from you. You can engage with Kyle or myself online through social media. We are at the.climbing.majority. Stay strong, climb well, be safe, and have fun. Until next time.